We are in the year of the Gospel of Mark, right? But for the next several Sundays, we are going to be hearing from the Gospel of John. Now, as you know, in the 3-year cycle, John is not part of that. But it's on these special occasions in the life of the church that we get to hear and wrestle with John's Gospel. Now, I need to remind you that this Sunday, even though we called it Low Sunday, is part of a whole season, the Easter season. Just like Lent was a season, 40 days, Easter is a season. And so in a certain sense, what we did on Easter Day, ringing the bells and all that good hippity-doo stuff, that is supposed to be part of what we do through this whole Easter cycle, because it is a focusing on the power of the resurrection. Now, just to give you a little bit about the Gospel of John, because we don't deal with John all the time. The Gospel of Mark, as you good Episcopalians know, was written some 40 years after Jesus' life and resurrection, sometime around 70 A.D. Mark, and followed by Matthew and Luke, attempted to give historical data about Jesus' life and ministry. And biblical scholars all through the years have wrestled with what was really part of Jesus' life and what was the craft of the storytellers. And they have all kinds of ways of trying to discern that. The Gospel of John was written some 20 to 30 years after the Synoptic Gospels. You need to know that there is little or anything in the Gospel of John that is historical. Now, of course, the resurrection is historical because that's in the Synoptic tradition. The crucifixion is historical because that's in the Synoptic tradition. But most of the rest that's in the Gospel of John is the craft of the storyteller. Now, a lot of people get a little uncomfortable about that, because if the Bible is supposed to be the Word of God, then it should be accurate. It should be factual. And we get a little uncomfortable thinking about the Bible as story. But go way back to the beginning, the Genesis story of creation. Is that factual? Well, some people think so. Some people still like to think that the earth was really created in those 7 days of creation, and that it is a young earth after all, only 6,000 years old. And all of this stuff about millions of years of creation, well, that's just hocus pocus. That's what the scientists talk about, but that's not real. The earth came about in 6 days. But fortunately, most Episcopalians at least have no trouble accepting the Genesis story as a story, as a mythic story. That means it's not untrue, it's just not literally true. So the Gospel of John, you have to look at it in the same kind of fashion. It's stories that are true, but not necessarily literally true. So here we have today John's resurrection appearances. You might remember just a week ago we read the Gospel of Mark. What did the Gospel of Mark have about resurrection appearances? Zip. Nothing. All you had in the Gospel of Mark was an empty tomb. And the angels who said, he's going before you into Galilee. That's all Mark had. And of course, Matthew and Luke said, no, this is not good. We have to have some resurrection stories. And so they had their own stories. And then, of course, the Gospel of John comes with another story. Most of the time, when people hear this story, however, what do they focus on? Thomas. Good old doubting Thomas. And we tend to, put Thomas down a little bit. Thomas, you should have just believed right from the get-go. The reality is, Thomas is much more like us than what we acknowledge. What is the age that we are in that some people refer to it as? The scientific age, right? And we are an age that wants to have belief based on credible scientific data. That's what we all learn in school, right? And that's how our world functions. So Thomas was really not out of that camp. He basically said, don't tell me your stories about seeing Jesus. I want to see it. I want to be able to verify that it's real. So we really ought to call him not Thomas, doubting Thomas, but Thomas the scientist. It would be a much better way of describing him. But whether he was a scientist or not, the ultimate focus of John's story is really not on Thomas. It's on Jesus. Because here's this group of people. We don't know if it was just 12 or it was a larger community. But it was a group of people who were afraid because Jesus, their leader, had been killed. What's going to happen to them? And Jesus stands in their midst. Now, is that scary stuff or what? It's certainly not what we would have experienced. I don't think anybody here has experienced that. But I might just add something. If you've done any reading on near-death experiences, people who are lying on a bed, dead, have experiences of encountering phenomena. So it's not so far-fetched. So here is this group of people. Jesus stands in their midst. And he does three things that are really profound. First, he says it twice, peace be with you. We're talking about a peace that is much larger than negotiations between, let's say, North Korea and Donald Trump. Maybe peace will come out of that, maybe will not. But this is a peace that passes all understanding. And Jesus says that twice. Then, when they know that it is Jesus, what does he do to them? He sends them. He says, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. This is the commissioning story, if you wish, in the Gospel of John. It's not the way it is in the Gospel of Matthew, where it's 40 days after the resurrection. Jesus is on the mountaintop, and he says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. The commissioning story is right from the beginning. And then he breathes on them. Pentecost in the Gospel of John doesn't wait 50 days. It's right there at the resurrection story. The empowerment of the Spirit is given right from the beginning. And with it, as a little caveat, you may have wondered what this meant. The sins of those you're given the power, the sins of those you forgive are forgiven, and the sins of those you retain are retained. Come on, that's what priests do. It's not what us everyday people do, right? But we're about the process of healing people from their sins. Now, we're not talking about petty little sins. You know, when we think about, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have lied here. I shouldn't have deceived somebody there. You know, we have all those little petty sins, right? John is talking about the sin of the world, which we are all enmeshed with. We're talking about sins of war. We're talking about sins of hunger. We're talking about sins of poverty. We're talking about sins against creation, against this Mother Earth that's our home. This is the real sin. This is the sin that we're part of. And yet we are given the power to forgive sins, because we really can't go on if we're weighted down by the reality of that sin. The only way we can move forward in this sinful world is to be redeemed. And that's what the Gospel of John is about. That's what Jesus was about in this resurrection story. It's a powerful story, and it is a mystical story. Because just as Jesus was resurrected from death into life, we are also resurrected from death to sin. That's the reading from 1 John. To new life as being the people of God. It's powerful stuff. And that's why we need a whole season to talk about this, to let it really get into us and make us aware of what we are as the resurrected people. Amen.